I have this tendency to go moo right now. Is there a reason for that?
Well, this was the loading and unloading chute for cattle being brought into or taken from the feedlot.
Okay, now this feedlot is actually a special feedlot for your family, isn't it?
It was, I've been told, the first feedlot in all the western states when I was on a tour of feedlots sponsored by the Western Livestock Journal, a publication that serves the livestock industry.
That's pretty cutting edge.
I had no clue that this was the first one. It was in our backyard.
And a lot of these other feedlots that are around the country has actually been fashioned about off of this.
A builder of feedlots is the one that said this was the first one in the western states, and his father or grandfather came out to study with my grandfather to learn how they built this feedlot and how it was arranged and how it was put together.
Nice.
What made it function efficiently.
Oh, I like that. So you'd have cattle, they'd be ushered through a bunch of gates over there, and then if they ever needed any kind of help, they would go in a contraption like this.
It's called a squeeze chute usually, or a cattle chute, and they could be confined and held so that they wouldn't get injured or the handlers wouldn't get injured because they weren't used to being, they're not pets, they weren't used to being handled.
Ah, so they could work on them in here.
A nose piece and a head piece to hold the head still, and squeezing the sides in to fit the cow, and the back gate would drop to hold her in.
Also then they'll go going backwards.
So keep them from backing out.
Okay. Now we have this right here. This looks like a holding area.
This is a unique corral that was on rails. You can see the wheels at the bottom of it, and on the rail that it was on is still there, and it was rolled onto the scale, and this is where they get an average weight of cattle coming or going, or
Okay.
anything else they needed to weigh to get a weight of the cattle for keeping records.
And this right here is the actual scale.
This is the actual scale.
Okay, now for the record here, I'm standing on here, you're standing on there. I do not weigh this much, okay? I'm just telling you right off the bat. But this right here was called the scale house?
Yes.
The scale house. When I first saw this, I was so excited about
Technically, it could be the weighmaster's shed, probably.
Okay, and this thing can go all the way up to 18,000 pounds. That's a lot of burger.
The county used to certify it to make sure that it was accurate.
Wow.
I told my mother she could be called a certified weighmaster if she wanted.
Really? Well, as I understand it, you would have a lot of cattle that would come in. They'd be brought in at a certain age because you're not weaning them or anything like that, right?
No, they would have been weaned cattle. They might have been on pasture for a little bit of time, and then they were brought in here and put in the feedlot, and they would be fed anywhere from a minimum of 30 days to 120 days.
Okay, and that's
depending upon the weight and how much weight you want on them before they're marketed.
And one type of food that they would get would come out of this house right here.
This was the hay barn, and the big trucks would roll in here, and the doors would slide so they could offload the hay and stack it in the barn.
And it would stay dry because it's inside?
Keep it out of the weather, to keep it dry, yes.
Okay, so once the hay was all stacked, it would have to be processed?
Well, it was taken from the stack and put on a conveyor.
All right, and it was grabbed, wasn't it?
It was grabbed by big tongs and swung down onto a conveyor, and the conveyor then moved it over to a table.
And by the way, the conveyor, your grandfather built.
As far as I know, one of his inventions.
Okay.
And the hay was then, bales were broken apart, the twine taken, or the wire taken off, and it was fed through the chute that's behind you over there, and chopped into a finer, the flakes were chopped up into fine hay, and then it was blown into a 2-story feeder, and you'll see the feeder later. That was a massive pipe would blow it. I mean, the mechanism was blown into the 2-story feeder, and there was a manger at the base, and it was a gravity-fed then device where the hay would drop down to the manger, and the cattle could eat all they wanted as often as they wanted.
How many?
And it saved having to feed the cattle or pitch hay to them.
How many cattle was typically over here then?
Anywhere from up to 400 head.
Wow.
That was quite a bit.
Did you guys ever give them names?
No.
No.
They were not pets.
Okay, so between the machine the conveyor that your grandfather built, this grinder over here, it needed something to do that, because it wasn't just a hand crank thing, was it? How did they operate it?
How did they operate this engine?
Yeah.
They had to start it by hand.
Oh, this one right here. This is the one that would.
This was the engine that ran the belt. You can see part of the old belting here.
Oh, that's a huge belt.
Grinder. It's a huge belt.
Oh my, look at that. That's
Massive
ginormous.
And the engine powered that belt, and that's what ran the grinder that ground the hay into almost a meal. And this is the starting wheel here that you had to put a pipe in and turn the engine over a number of times to get it started. I think it ran on diesel.
Well, they say that man cannot live by bread alone, and I guess cattle can't live with hay alone. And this is the room that we're in, where they had a diversified diet.
Yes, this is the chute where grain came in from the grain tanks. The grain was produced on the property, and it was barley, oats, or wheat. It would be rotated for each year for different grain.
Which you guys grew.
They grew it on the property east of where we're standing now, and the grain came in from the tanks and was ground in this hammer mill, and then it was make a flour-like consistency, so it was easier for the cattle to digest it. And then there are tanks over here where my father kept minerals stored. There are 3 different tanks. A couple of them are old wood structures, and there's a metal one. And he stored the grains, the minerals there that he added to the ground up grain. And then it was put in a cart. We weighed it, and the cart went down to the feedlot. And the flaps went down, and so you were at this level, but the cattle were down below you, and the flaps went down and put the ground up grain in the chute below the catwalk that we were walking on with the grain cart.
So was all the carts part of this rail system?
Yes.
Because I do know that once we get way out there, we have the rail system goes to that one direction, and then it goes out to another direction. So they were pretty versatile in where they took them all.
Yes, they could bring in feed in sacks, like the dried figs that they would sometimes buy as a supplemental feed if the price was right. They would buy beet pulp that was sugar beet leftovers from making sugar out of beets, and then molasses from the sugar processing that was the tail end of the sugar manufacturing was added to the beet pulp, and then it would be sacked up, and the beet pulp was fed as a supplemental feed, sometimes to the cattle, but primarily to the dairy cattle, as a supplemental feed for the dairy cattle, along with some grain, sometimes ground and sometimes just cracked grain. So we're fed to the dairy cattle.
So once they were fed to the dairy cattle, do you know what size weight that the cattle would have to be before they were ready for market?
Well, the dairy cattle were of smaller numbers, just kept for milk. I don't know the weights that they sent these cattle to market on, but they would get them up to what they call a finish of so much fat per animal. And then they were marketed. Again, the commercial haulers would come in, and the big trucks would load them up through that same chute that we saw, and they would be taken to the market in Los Angeles.
Oh, so it was all done locally. So the chances were that the people in the nearby neighborhood, shall we say, they would be able to partake in them.
It would have gone to meat markets scattered across Southern California.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. All right, well, thank you very much. This is pretty exciting stuff. It's glad to know that this history is here and that you and your family was a part of that. And I appreciate the way that you're sharing it with us.
Well, it's rather unique and was normal for us, but rather rare for other people.